One of the top 3 wide receivers in the NFL draft should fall to the Chicago Bears with the 9th overall pick, but they might need a little bit of luck or some help from the other teams drafting in the top 10.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on all of your favorite social media platforms, including the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code to get $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, we look at how the top receivers in this draft, or one of them, could fall to the Chicago Bears with the 9th overall pick, based on some of the wide receiver movement we saw in free agency, the wide receiver movement we could still see between now and draft day, and some of the other movement we could see at the top of this draft before the Bears pick that help one of these wide receivers fall to where the Bears are with the 9th pick. The way that things played out this offseason, it has aligned better and better for someone, whether it's Rome Odunze or Malik Nabers. At this point, I don't think it'll be Marvin Harrison Jr., and I think it's probably most likely Rome Odunze at this point, but one of those wide receivers making it to when the Bears are on the clock with the 9th overall pick. Now, there's always room for unexpected things to happen, and trying to accurately predict the first 8 picks in the NFL draft in March tends to be fool's errand. But I do think free agency set things up well for the Chicago Bears in terms of other teams that might be interested in one of these top wide receivers, addressing the wide receiver position in other ways, namely through free agency. Like when you look at the teams picking before the Chicago Bears in this draft, some big wide receiver movement happened at spots that should help create the pathway for one of these wide receivers to fall. So like the biggest contract in wide receiver free agency this year, at least the biggest movement, I mean, franchise tag and stuff kind of changes this, but in terms of guys changing teams, we saw wide receiver Calvin Ridley leave the Jacksonville Jaguars and go to the Tennessee Titans, who happen to have the 7th overall pick in this year's draft and would be in a good position there to draft a wide receiver, a top number 1 type wide receiver with that 7th overall pick. But now they have Calvin Ridley to go with the veteran DeAndre Hopkins, who's certainly not washed at this point, but not what he once was, but still a very good receiver. And they used a first-round pick 2 years ago on Treylon Burks. So the Titans already have a lot invested at wide receiver. Does that mean there's zero chance they take one at 7? No. But they're a lot more likely to take one of the top offensive tackles with that 7th overall pick. They just traded for L'Jarius Sneed, so maybe not a cornerback there, but they could be a team for potentially Dallas Turner at the edge rusher spot there. Or, I mean, you never know where else they might throw a wild card in there. Could they take Brock Bowers, the tight end, with the 7th overall pick? Perhaps. But as long as the Tennessee Titans don't take a wide receiver, that eliminates one more team to allow one of these wide receivers to fall to the Chicago Bears. Or how about the Atlanta Falcons with the 8th overall pick? They go out and sign former Chicago Bear Darnell Mooney. And sure, is Darnell Mooney in a vacuum enough to keep you from drafting a wide receiver? No. But they already have Drake London as a first-round pick a couple of years ago, who's more in that number 1 wide receiver physical type mold. Darnell Mooney can be a really solid number 2 receiver for them. And they also acquired Rondale Moore in a trade from the Arizona Cardinals, and they signed Ray McCloud as a free agent. Like, sure, much like the Titans, does that mean they will 0% draft a wide receiver? No. But it feels like they've got a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4 there pretty well set in place to where wide receiver is not a big need for them. But they certainly could use a better pass rusher. They could probably use a better cornerback as well. Like there's other positions that they might want to address with a top 10 pick to where taking a wide receiver in that spot is less likely for them to actually do so. The only problem is in terms of free agency, the one team that created a need at wide receiver was the Los Angeles Chargers with that 5th overall pick. They went from having Keenan Allen and Mike Williams to trading Keenan Allen to the Chicago Bears, obviously, and then Mike Williams, they released him and he ends up signing with the New York Jets in free agency. They still have Quentin Johnson, their first-round pick from last year, and they like Josh Palmer a lot as a receiver, but clearly wide receiver has been created as a need for the Los Angeles Chargers. And we've already been kind of assuming that the Arizona Cardinals want to draft a wide receiver with the 4th overall pick. And so right there, you've got 2 wide receiver needy teams back to back in your draft order. But then, if we start to take out the Titans a little bit and take out the Falcons a little bit, and you assume the other 4 teams, the Bears, Commanders, Patriots, and Giants, are all after quarterbacks with those picks, then that would leave one of the wide receivers to still fall to the Chicago Bears. I mean, the Giants, we could talk about them in a minute here as kind of a wild card here in terms of a team that could take a quarterback, but I guess could, in theory, take a wide receiver in this case. But let's not forget that the wide receiver market is not done either. We still have, as of yesterday, a full month until draft day, and sitting out there as free agents are Odell Beckham Jr. You still got the Michael Gallup release from the Dallas Cowboys. Tyler Boyd is still out there from the Bengals. Hunter Renfrow from the Raiders. Sure, those guys aren't all bona fide number 1 wide receivers, but if you're a team that could kind of use a receiver and you sign one of those guys, all of a sudden you're a little bit less desperate or a little bit less, forced to feel like, oh man, I got to take one of these guys in the top of this draft. Like if I'm the New York Giants, I still have Jalen Hyatt, I've got Darius Slayton, I've got Wendell Robinson. They signed Isaiah McKenzie from the Colts. If you added, certainly an Odell Beckham, I don't think we'll see a reunion there, but you add a wide receiver to that mix, all of a sudden they're less likely to take one. Let's not forget the wide receivers available in trade. Brandon Ayuk from the 49ers, reportedly available via trade. T. Higgins from the Cincinnati Bengals, also reportedly could be available for the right price via trade. So, if any of these receivers go to the Arizona Cardinals or the New York Giants or the Los Angeles Chargers, or certainly, the Titans or Falcons added another wide receiver, you start to take out even more of the potential obstacles towards the Bears having the chance to draft any of these top 3 wide receivers, whichever one might fall to them. Today, it's not as important. I'm not here to argue how you want to rank Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Nabers, and Rome Odunze. The idea is that if any of the 3 of them came to the 9th overall pick, a lot of Chicago Bears fans are right on board to get that young first-round pick wide receiver to match up with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore and be that long-term piece there, but also give you 3 great threats as a rookie for Caleb Williams. There's a lot to like about what's a really strong wide receiver class at the top with 3 studs that any team would be really happy to get. The problem is in this process is that there are a few wild cards in here that could throw that draft math into a little bit of disarray there. We make some assumptions about, okay, these teams are drafting here and might draft this type of position, but I think there's a few spots within that top 8 before the Bears pick that we can't sit here today and be 100% confident in exactly how things are going to go. And that doesn't even include the possibility that a team trades up past the Bears to get ahead of the Bears to draft one of these wide receivers before the Bears get a chance to. So we'll look at the teams that I think are going to be the hardest to predict in this area, and then we'll turn our attention to some of the biggest threats to trade up past the Bears next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. Whether it's sports, concerts, comedy shows, theater events, you name it, if it's live and on a stage at any kind of venue, they've got it at Gametime with great last-minute deals and all-in pricing. So you're not going to get hit with any fees later in the process that ends up making it cost more than you thought it would. I really love being able to see the view from my seat in the Gametime app, so I know exactly what I'm getting and exactly what I'm paying for that view. I cannot recommend it enough. I use it all the time. I go to a bunch of concerts, went to a couple Bears games with Gametime last season as well. It's been a great experience every single time. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create that account and redeem our code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. You can see a pathway here for the Bears to land one of these top 3 receivers with the 9th overall pick. But I think there's a couple teams in and around the top 10 here that create some wild cards that I don't think we can sit here today and say definitively like, yes, this is the clear path to the Bears getting the 9th overall pick. Like, there is clearly a path. But for example, a team like the New England Patriots with the 3rd overall pick worry me a little bit for a couple of reasons. One, there's no guarantee that as we sit here today, the New England Patriots are going to draft a quarterback with that 3rd overall pick. You would think when you're drafting in the top 3 in a draft class that has a lot of quality at the top of the quarterback position, that if they're sitting there at number 3, they would want to get their franchise quarterback of the future. But New England might look at this draft class and say, okay, we really like Caleb Williams and we really like, let's say, Drake May. And if those 2 quarterbacks go 1 and 2 and the Patriots go, well, we don't really love Jaden Daniels and we don't really love J.J. McCarthy, we can just stay at 3 and take Marvin Harrison Jr. And all of a sudden, there's another wide receiver off the board. And then if the Patriots take Marvin Harrison Jr., and then the Cardinals take Malik Nabers, and then the Chargers take Rome Odunze, I mean, it would be weird to see wide receivers go back to back to back, but it's not totally out of the question that the Patriots could take a wide receiver, and we're already sort of assuming that the Cardinals and Chargers will likely prefer wide receivers in this draft. Now, that's no guarantee either. Either of those teams could opt to go with some other player at some other position. But right now, the expectation is like those 2 teams want wide receivers. And the Patriots could see like, yeah, Marvin Harrison is their top player in this draft. And if they don't love the other quarterback options, like it's not like they're set at quarterback anyway. I mean, they got Brissett and Bailey Zappi. So it feels like they should take a quarterback. But are they going to take a quarterback for the sake of taking out a quarterback? Or would they just consider saying, yeah, screw it. We'll take one of these great wide receivers and we'll figure out the quarterback position some other time. Like that to me makes for a pretty big wild card there, especially because, okay, maybe they don't want a quarterback at 3, but another team might want that quarterback to 3. And, say it's the New York Giants that want to get up there and make sure they get their quarterback in that spot. Or if for some reason Atlanta really wants to go all in on a quarterback right now, I mean, however you want to think about it, like could the Patriots trade down to 6 with the Giants? So the Giants get their QB at 3 instead of risking him not making it to 6. And then the Patriots take that wide receiver at 6, and it's still that wide receiver off the board. Like the key thing for the Bears here is that you need 4 quarterbacks to go in the top 8, 2 wide receivers to go in the top 8, and then 2 other players, probably an offensive tackle like Joe Alt, and then some kind of defensive player like an edge rusher of like a Dallas Turner, or maybe one of the top cornerbacks like Cooper DeJean, like one of those type of players. They need a defensive player, another offensive player, and then 2 wide receivers, 4 quarterbacks. Like, or maybe Brock Bowers could be one of those players, but right, you need 4 quarterbacks to go off the board there, and you need the other 4 picks to not include 3 wide receivers. That's sort of the basic math the Chicago Bears are looking at. Because you start to throw in that, like the Giants trading up is another one of these big wild cards here. When they sit at the 6th overall pick, if they want to jump up to 5 or 4 or 3, if they go up and get one of these quarterbacks, then that keeps one of these other teams from also trading up for one of these quarterbacks. Like if the Giants move up and nobody else wants to move up for that number 4 quarterback, well, then all of a sudden, okay, if you only get 3 quarterbacks in the top 8, then you need 5 other players to go before the Bears pick. And it's a good chance that 3 of those 5 other ones will be wide receivers. Like how many non-wide receivers are going to go in the top 8 picks, especially non-wide receiver, non-quarterback type players. So that's where the Patriots for me are a big wild card here. The Giants can be a potential wild card here. And then I still think the Atlanta Falcons are a real wild card here with the 8th overall pick. Right before the Chicago Bears are on the clock, the Atlanta Falcons will get the last selection there. And I know we talked about it. They got Drake London. They got Darnell Mooney. They got Rondale Moore. They've invested a lot at wide receiver this offseason, and it would seem like a lot for them to invest even more in the wide receiver position. But at the same time, they're all in on Kirk Cousins right now. They're all in on trying to support him and win a lot of football games as soon as possible in that regard. And so I could see the temptation there to add even more at wide receiver, especially when you look at the wide receiver additions they made. You know, we all know the Darnell Mooney story, right? He's been a 1,000-yard guy, but he hasn't been the last 2 seasons. He's been a 450-yard guy the last 2 seasons. So he's not like a guaranteed going to be a 1,000-yard guy, perfect running mate for Drake London. And they traded for Rondale Moore, who was also, you know, back in his day, a second-round pick 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, however long it's been. But in his career, he's never been more than about a 450-yard guy. So could you see a reality where, I mean, the Falcons paid Darnell Mooney $13 million a year. Like, they definitely view him as a key player in their offense. But could they say, you know what, like, Mooney's kind of our number 2/number 3, and we see Rondale Moore as our number 4/number 5. And if we draft a wide receiver at 8, then like London's the 1, and then Mooney and the rookie can kind of switch between 2 and 3, and we'll use all 3 of them and have a lot of success. Like, I can still see the Falcons, in spite of everything they've added at wide receiver this offseason, still feeling like it's a big enough need that they could justify using the pick there. Like, I don't see the same conversation for Tennessee, because it was literally a first-round pick for Treylon Burks 2 years ago, and DeAndre Hopkins is not a cheap wide receiver, and Calvin Ridley is not a cheap wide receiver, and your rookie would be like number 4 in that pecking order. But Atlanta is just easy enough to sell me on, and certainly talking to Aaron Freeman from Locked On Falcons, I think wide receiver is definitely in consideration for them. But, you know, it'll kind of depend on how else the rest of that draft goes, because they would also be, in the same vein, a prime team to trade down. If one of those wide receivers is sitting on the board at 8, and the Falcons go, yeah, we don't really need a wide receiver. We don't really need a cornerback. We could trade down and still get a cornerback or an edge rusher we like. We don't need that wide receiver right here. We could trade down a few spots. Like, that makes them a big wild card, and it opens up the possibility for any number of teams trading up for one of these wide receivers. The wide receivers makes it through the first 7 picks, and you're sitting there, and Atlanta's on the clock at 8, and Rome Odunze is sitting there. And I think there's a handful of teams that would be willing to and interested in trading up to get past the Chicago Bears to draft one of these top wide receivers. We'll look at who the biggest threats are and, you know, how we might kind of weigh the risk for the Chicago Bears there next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook. No matter how your bracket is looking right now, that's okay, because win or lose, FanDuel will let you bet on every game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or just riding out the number 1 seeds, it's time to go dancing on America's number 1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. So you bet $5 on anything across sports, and if that bet is successful, not only do you get the winnings from your $5 bet, but they'll add an extra $200 in bonus bucks right into your account that you can use to bet on point spreads, money lines. You can pick who's going to win it all. You can bet on NFL draft prop bets, and so much more on FanDuel, all in their app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So to get your $200 in bonus bets, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops till they cut down the nets. The biggest thing the Chicago Bears can't control in this is what other teams might do to get past them. Other teams might look at the Chicago Bears and go, man, if Rome Odunze is there, or Malik Nabers, or somehow Marvin Harrison, like if one of those receivers is there, the Bears are going to take them at 9, and they might think, oh man, if I want one of these wide receivers, I got to get past them. But fortunately, if I'm their team, I might not have to get very far past them. Like, Atlanta feels like a pretty sweet spot there to go up and get your wide receiver, whatever of the wide receivers ends up making it that far. And I think there's, I would say, 3 or 4 teams, and then I think there's sort of the possibility of a double trade, but 3 or 4 main teams that would trade up, and then a couple of teams that could be like a double trade to get back ahead of the Bears that all pose some of the biggest threats, picking after where the Chicago Bears are with the 9th overall pick. Right away, It's the team picking right after the Bears, the New York Jets. They're a team that did sign Mike Williams from the Los Angeles Chargers. So they've been able to address the wide receiver position in some way that it's not like a huge need. And they still have Garrett Wilson. Like those are two really solid wide receivers. I guess Alan Lazard is in that conversation too. But like there's room for a third receiver to be added to that mix. Mike Williams very much a short-term answer there. But you could see them move up 2 spots to go from 10 to 8. Like that might be worth it to them to get a wide receiver. I don't think the Jets are going to go up to 4 to get Marvin Harrison, but to jump 1 spot over the Bears for a 4th round pick or a 3rd round pick or whatever that might cost. I mean, I could see them being interested in doing so. I think that's less the case with the quarterback needy teams. You know, the Vikings at 11, obviously they got Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison. Like they're not going to move up past the Bears for a wide receiver. They might move up past the Bears for a quarterback. And that could take a team like Arizona out of it. If say the Vikings trade up to from 11 to 4 to take J.J. McCarthy, then all of a sudden the Cardinals are no longer taking a wide receiver there, and that leaves another wide receiver to fall to the Bears. Or if the Broncos at 12 or the Raiders at 13, like 11, 12, 13, if any of those teams trade up for a quarterback in the top 8 of the draft, that could potentially eliminate another team that might take a wide receiver. So like those would be good trade-ups for the Bears. But the Jets moving up for a wide receiver would not help. And I think the New Orleans Saints could be in this conversation as a team to trade up for a wide receiver. And they moved on from Michael Thomas, finally. They still have Chris Olave, and he's their 1st round guy. They signed Cedric Wilson from the Dolphins, but he was more like, number 3 type guy there. They have Rashid Shaheed, but like they could use that like true running mate for Chris Olave, and they're still in kind of more of a win now window with Derek Carr and everything. So I could see them wanting to be aggressive. And again, moving up 6 spots is not nothing, but they're not a huge leap there. And they do have, a lot of late round picks in this draft that they can use to sort of acquire more players. There's not a lot to move up for there, but they're a team that's definitely in the mix here to trade up from the 14th overall spot in this year's draft. From there, it would be teams that have to make a slightly bigger leap there. Like I think the Jacksonville Jaguars at 17 would be interesting. They did go out and sign Gabe Davis as a free agent, but they lost Calvin Ridley, and I don't think that's quite a 1-to-1 replacement there. Like they've got Christian Kirk, they've got Zay Jones, they've got Gabe Davis. So, I mean, they're fine at wide receiver. Are they going to be desperate to move up for one? Probably not. But they're not so set at wide receiver that we can totally rule it out. And honestly, like I'd throw the Cincinnati Bengals in that same conversation where it's like, okay, if they're going to roll with Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, they're not going to trade up for a wide receiver. But if between now and draft day, they trade away T. Higgins because they just don't want to pay that and they can get a good draft capital in return, could the Bengals be a team that says, okay, now all we got is Jamar Chase. We got to go get another young receiver to pair with him. Like that to me makes them a wild card if and only if they trade T. Higgins away. So, I mean, I don't think the threats are glaring there. I think it's the Jets and the Saints are the most likely ones there. I don't think like the Colts and the Seahawks at 15 or 16 are huge threats there, and a lot of the other quarterback needy teams are not going to move up for wide receivers. So it's not like, oh man, there are a dozen teams all chomping at the bit to get past the Bears and draft one of these wide receivers, but you can't rule it out. The other thing that you can't rule out here is the double trade, and that's the other thing that worries me quite a bit. It's like, okay, if you're the Arizona Cardinals at 4 or the Los Angeles Chargers at 5 and the Minnesota Vikings at 11 call you and say, okay, we want to move up for one of these quarterbacks. All right, great. Give us a bunch of draft picks or whatever. The Vikings, it could be the Broncos, it could be the Raiders, but let's stick with the Vikings for a second. Like the Vikings give up a haul to move to 4 where the Cardinals are. And so the Cardinals drop down to 11. Could the Cardinals then trade up from 11 to 8? And draft one of the wide receivers, right? Like, same thing could be true with the Chargers. Like, if the Cardinals or the Chargers traded out of the top 10 for a team that wants to move up for a quarterback, either of those teams would now have a bunch of draft capital that they could make a much smaller move up to the Falcons at 8 or the Titans at 7 or even the Giants at 6 if they can't get a quarterback they like, and then still move up and still get one of these wide receivers. So they get the best of both worlds. They get to trade down and get a bunch of capital for a quarterback, but then they can still give up a little bit of that capital to move back up and get one of the wide receivers they would have wanted with that pick anyway. Like that's what I think I'm more worried about. I'm not as worried about the Jets or the Saints necessarily making that jump up, but if one of these teams trades out of the top 10 and then back into the top 10 to get past the Bears, that could be the sneaky move that takes Rome Odunze away one pick before the Bears might have the opportunity to add him. It does open up the possibility, people have floated out there, could the Bears then trade up from 9 to move higher up into the top 10 to still get one of these wide receivers? Could you trade with the Giants at 6 or the Titans at 7? I don't feel an urgency to do so for a couple of reasons. One, if the Bears don't draft one of these wide receivers, they'll be fine. It would be fun to draft one of these wide receivers. They don't desperately need a wide receiver the way the Cardinals desperately need a wide receiver. The Chargers desperately need a wide receiver. The Bears can survive if they don't get a wide receiver in the first round. They'll be all right. So there's not that huge urgency to move up for one. And B, the whole premise of this podcast, the Bears might not have a reason to move up for one. Again, there's a decent chance that one of them will fall to 9. So the only reason you would move up for one is if you're scared that the Falcons are going to take one or scared that the Falcons are going to trade down and let someone else take one. But would the Bears have the intel to know that another team is looking to trade past them to get a wide receiver so then the Bears could trade up to try and get that wide receiver? To me, it becomes like Inception and a lot of moving parts and one of those boards with the strings and the pins in it. You're trying to find the suspect or whatever. It's okay, if this team's moving there and that team's moving here, do we need to move up here for a wide receiver? It's I don't think it needs to be that complicated for the Bears, right? If the wide receiver makes it to you at 9, great. If they all get picked before 9 or someone trades up for it, good for them, I guess. But I'm not going to lose sleep over, man, we just didn't get the opportunity to do so. It feels kind of like Jalen Carter last year. I mean, obviously, Carter, very different circumstances in terms of the prospect. But last year, a lot of us were hoping Jalen Carter would fall to the Bears were they picking at 8 or 9 last year before they traded down? Once about 9, I think, to fall to the Bears in their first round pick. And it was should the Bears trade up for Jalen Carter? Is another team going to trade up for Jalen Carter? And as the draft went on, Jalen Carter was there where the Bears picked, and they still traded down. And I wonder if we'll hit a similar situation with the wide receivers this year, where it's should the Bears should they trade up for a wide receiver? Do you got to trade up to get him? Is somebody going to trade up past the Bears for a wide receiver? And then we'll be watching in draft day, and one of those receivers might be on the board at 9. And the Bears might still trade down. We got to prepare ourselves for that possibility after we saw it happen with Jalen Carter last season. Ryan Poles is not going to be married to any one of these outcomes. I know, again, it's not a one-to-one comparison of the Carter situation and these wide receivers, but just conceptually, the idea of a guy you're hoping falls there might still fall there. You don't have to trade up for him, and you might still trade down even if he ends up falling to where you're picking in this draft. So that's where the wide receiver and draft order math plays out for the Bears. I do think there's a good chance one of them is there at 9. I don't think the Bears have to trade up to get them, and I'm not 100% convinced that the Bears would take them if they're on the clock and that wide receiver is there. Because the Bears could trade down to another team that wants to move up for one of those wide receivers to get past the Jets. You know what I mean? There's always another angle you can kind of look at it from a draft perspective. So we'll see, but I think the chances are in your favor that the Bears have a pretty good choice to make with that 9th overall pick. I'd love to hear what you think about their options with the wide receivers at 9. Do you take one if they're there? Are you open to trading down even if one of those wide receivers is there? Or do you feel like the Bears have to trade up to get one of these wide receivers? Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, or you can tweet us at Locked On Bears or post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. However you do it, just make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's going to be the best way to keep up with all of our daily in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Coming back tomorrow, as we're going to keep looking at this 9th overall pick and look at some of the potential trade down possibilities, whether or not one of the wide receivers is there. And we want to go more in depth on these wide receivers as well. And the decision at the 9th overall pick, do you take one of these wide receivers? Which wide receiver would you like to take? And really kind of go in depth in that position coming here in the coming days on the Locked On Bears podcast. So keep coming back, keep making us your first listen each and every day. And in exchange, I'll always make sure to give you an opportunity to bear down.